Michael had been saving for years to buy his first home in Oak Ridge Estates. After closing on the modest three-bedroom house, he spent weekends repainting and furnishing it to his taste. Though the Homeowners Association had strict rules, Michael made sure to follow them carefully, or so he thought. He never encountered someone like Brenda Wilson, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA guidelines and treasurer of the board. Neighbors warned Michael about her, sharing stories of her meticulous measurements of grass height and her infamous clipboard inspections, but he brushed off their concerns, believing that following the rules would be enough. The day Michael moved in was unusually warm for April. Sweat trickled down his back as he carried the last of his boxes from the U-Haul into the house. Standing on his new front lawn, he allowed himself a moment of pride. At 34, he finally achieved the milestone that had seemed so distant during his years in that cramped apartment downtown. The house wasn't extravagant, a 1990s build with decent bones and outdated fixtures, but it was his. "You must be the new owner." The voice came from behind, startling Michael from his reverie. He turned to see a woman in her 50s with immaculately styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses perched on her nose. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Brenda Wilson, HOA treasurer. Welcome to Oak Ridge." Michael shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "Thanks, I'm Michael Chen. Just finished moving in today." Brenda's gaze swept over his property, lingering on the U-Haul. "The association allows moving vehicles for 24 hours only. I assume you'll have that gone by tomorrow?" She pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from her purse and made a note. "Of course," Michael replied, trying to maintain his good mood. "It's scheduled for pickup in the morning." "Excellent." She handed him a thick binder. "Our complete HOA guidelines. I suggest you familiarize yourself thoroughly. We pride ourselves on maintaining standards here in Oak Ridge." Her eyes narrowed slightly as she gestured toward his front door, which he painted a deep navy blue the previous weekend. "I notice you've already changed the exterior paint. I hope you submitted the proper form for approval." Michael felt a flicker of anxiety. "I did, actually. Submitted it last week and got approval on Tuesday. Color #4233 Midnight Harbor. It's on the approved list." Something like disappointment flashed across Brenda's face before she nodded curtly. "Very well. I'll be checking my records." She turned to leave but paused. "Oh, and your grass is currently 3.4 inches. Our limit is 3 inches. You might want to address that soon." As Brenda walked away, Michael's next-door neighbor, Dave, emerged from his garage and approached with a sympathetic smile. "I see you've met the Dragon Lady," he said in a low voice. "Is she always like that?" Michael asked, watching Brenda's retreating figure. Dave chuckled. "That was her being friendly. Wait until she finds something actually wrong." He helped Michael close up the moving truck. "Last summer, she measured the angle of my garden hose reel with a protractor and issued a violation because it was visible from the street." "You're kidding," Michael said. "Wish I was. Listen, most of us just try to stay under her radar. The rest of the board is reasonable, but Brenda's got nothing better to do than police the neighborhood." Dave pointed to the binder in Michael's hands. "Read that thing cover to cover. She knows it by heart and will use any technicality she can find." Michael thanked Dave for the warning but couldn't help feeling that his neighbors were exaggerating. After all, how bad could one person really be? He'd always been good at following rules, and while the HOA guidelines seemed extensive, they weren't unreasonable. Besides, the house had passed inspection just fine, including the mailbox that came with it, a simple black metal design on a wooden post that matched several others on the street. That night, as Michael unpacked his kitchen, he glanced through the window to see Brenda slowly walking past his house, clipboard in hand, pausing occasionally to make notes. Under the glow of the streetlights, her figure cast a long shadow across his freshly mowed lawn. 3 months after moving in, Michael returned home from work to find a violation notice taped to his front door. According to Brenda, his mailbox didn't comply with HOA standards. It was the wrong shade of black and 2 inches taller than regulation height. The notice demanded immediate replacement with an approved model, despite the fact that the mailbox had been there when he purchased the house. Michael took photos of other mailboxes on the street that seemed identical to his and emailed the HOA board requesting clarification, but received no response. The bright pink paper stood out against his navy door like a neon sign declaring his failure to the entire neighborhood. Michael snatched it down quickly, glancing around to see if any neighbors had noticed. The paper was warm from sitting in the afternoon sun, the edges crisp as though the person who placed it had taken special care to make it perfectly straight. "Notice of violation," read the bold header, followed by his address and the date. Below that, in meticulous handwriting, was a detailed description of his alleged infraction. "Mailbox in violation of HOA Covenant Section 7.32. All mailboxes must be regulation size, 20 height maximum from base to top, and colored Oak Ridge Standard Black, #0C0C0C. Current mailbox measures 22 in height and appears to be satin black, hashtag 100C08. Violation must be corrected within 10 days of this notice or fines of $25/day will be assessed. At the bottom was Brenda's flowing signature, complete with a little flower dotting the I in Wilson, a bizarre touch of whimsy from someone so rigid about rules. Michael crumpled the notice in his fist before catching himself. He would need this as evidence if he was going to fight it. Smoothing out the paper, he walked to his mailbox and examined it. It looked exactly like at least 5 others on the street, including Dave's next door. He pulled out his phone and took several photos of his mailbox from different angles, then walked down the street photographing the other similar ones. Inside, Michael pulled out a measuring tape from his toolbox and measured his mailbox. It was indeed 22 inches from base to top. He checked the HOA binder Brenda had given him when he moved in, flipping to section 7.32. The wording matched exactly what was on the violation notice. How had he missed this? The previous owners must have installed a non-compliant mailbox and somehow it had never been flagged until now. Michael opened his laptop and composed a careful email to the HOA board. He attached his photos showing the identical mailboxes throughout the neighborhood and pointed out that his home inspection prior to purchase had not flagged any violations. He asked for clarification on why his mailbox was being singled out when others identical to it were apparently acceptable. Is there a grandfather clause for fixtures that predated the current regulations? He wrote, or has there been a recent change to the standards? I'm happy to comply with all HOA requirements, but I would appreciate some consistency in how these rules are applied. He clicked send, feeling confident that his reasonable approach would resolve the issue. Michael even contemplated simply replacing the mailbox to avoid trouble, but the principle bothered him. If the rule wasn't being enforced consistently, why should he have to spend money fixing something that wasn't broken? The next day at work, Michael checked his email repeatedly, expecting a response from someone on the board. Nothing came. That evening, he ran into Dave while taking out the trash. Hey, I got a violation notice about my mailbox yesterday, and Michael said, have you ever received one about yours? They look identical to me. Dave raised his eyebrows. Your mailbox? That's a new one. No, never got a complaint about mine, and I've been here 8 years. He looked thoughtful. What exactly was the violation? Michael explained about the height and color specifications. Dave shook his head. That's Brenda finding new ways to flex her power. Last month, it was the Andersons' wind chimes being excessively sonorous, whatever that means. But the mailbox has been here since before I bought the place, Michael protested. Doesn't matter to her. Once Brenda sets her sights on something, she doesn't let go. Dave lowered his voice. Word is she's gunning for HOA president next election. This is her way of showing how vigilant she is about community standards. Michael checked his email again before bed. Still no response from the board. He sent a follow-up the next morning, copying all the email addresses listed in the HOA directory. By the end of the week, his inbox remained conspicuously empty of any official response. He received 2 separate emails from Brenda, reminding him that his violation timeline was proceeding and that failure to address non-compliant fixtures will result in further action. A week later, Michael left for a weekend business trip. When he returned Sunday evening, his mailbox was gone, post and all. There was nothing but a hole in the ground where it had stood. Confused and angry, he checked his security camera footage to discover Brenda herself in broad daylight, digging up and removing his mailbox while wearing garden gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. The footage clearly showed her loading it into the trunk of her sedan and driving away. Several pieces of Michael's mail lay scattered on the ground where the mailbox had been. The business trip to Chicago couldn't have come at a worse time. Michael had been monitoring his emails all week for a response from the HOA board that never came, and the deadline on his violation notice was fast approaching. He'd finally broken down and researched replacement mailboxes that would meet the exact specifications, wincing at the $189 price tag for an Oak Ridge-approved model from Wilson's Hardware, owned, not coincidentally, by Brenda's husband. I'll deal with it when I get back Sunday, he told himself as he locked up Friday morning. He had installed a smart doorbell camera last month, one of his first security upgrades to the new house. At least he could keep an eye on things while he was gone. The conference kept him busy, and he barely checked his phone except to order an Uber back to his hotel each night. By Sunday afternoon, exhausted from networking and panel discussions, he was more than ready to be home. His flight landed at 5:42 p.m., and by 7:15, his taxi was turning onto Oak Ridge Drive. The first sign something was wrong came when the driver pulled up to his house. In the fading twilight, Michael stared at the empty space where his mailbox should have been. Instead of the black metal box on its wooden post, there was only a ragged hole surrounded by disturbed soil. A few white envelopes lay scattered on the grass nearby. Wait here, he told the driver, jumping out of the car. Michael approached the spot slowly, as if expecting the mailbox to reappear. He picked up the scattered mail, a credit card statement, a flyer for lawn care services, and what looked like a birthday card from his mother. The envelopes were dirty, with tire tracks across one of them. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking up and down the street. No sign in his mailbox, not even fragments. This wasn't vandalism. The entire thing had been removed deliberately. Michael paid the taxi driver and rolled his suitcase into the house, anger building with each step. Inside, he dropped his bags and immediately opened his phone app to check the doorbell camera footage. He scrolled back through the weekend recordings, looking for any unusual activity. There, Saturday morning, 10:17 a.m. His thumbnail hovered over the video, then clicked play. The footage showed a silver Mercedes pulling up in front of his house. Brenda Wilson emerged from the driver's side, wearing large sunglasses, a wide-brimmed sun hat, and garden gloves. She glanced furtively up and down the street before opening her trunk and removing a shovel and what looked like a large pry bar. Michael's jaw dropped as he watched Brenda march purposefully to his mailbox. She first tried to wiggle it loose, then began digging around the base of the post. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed her working for nearly 15 minutes, loosening the concrete footing and eventually using the pry bar to lever the entire structure, post and all, out of the ground. Once freed, she dragged the mailbox across Michael's lawn, leaving a trail in the grass. A few envelopes fell out as she manhandled it toward her car. Without bothering to pick them up, she heaved the entire mailbox into her trunk, tossed in her tools, and closed the lid. After one more glance around the neighborhood, she drove away. "You've got to be kidding me," Michael whispered, rewatching the video in disbelief. He checked the footage from later that day and saw the mail carrier arrive, looked confused at the missing mailbox, and then drop Michael's mail on the ground near where the box had been. Michael paced his living room, phone in hand, wondering who to call. The police? The HOA board? A lawyer? This went beyond petty neighborhood politics. She had stolen his property and his mail. He pulled up Brenda's contact information from the HOA directory and started to dial, then stopped himself. No. Confronting her while this angry wasn't smart. He needed to think this through carefully. Instead, he texted Dave, "You won't believe what happened. My mailbox is gone, and I have video of who took it." Michael knocked on Brenda's door the next morning, his laptop in hand, ready to show her the footage. She answered with a plastic smile, clipboard already in hand. When confronted about the mailbox, Brenda didn't deny taking it. Instead, she informed him that the HOA bylaws allowed for removal of non-compliant fixtures after a warning period. When Michael pointed out that tampering with mailboxes was a federal offense, she laughed dismissively and said, "This is HOA property, dear. Federal laws don't override our covenant." She refused to return the mailbox, suggesting he purchase an approved model from her husband's hardware store instead. Michael barely slept that night. Dave had come over to watch the footage and was equally outraged but advised caution. "Document everything," he said. "This goes beyond her usual power trips." By morning, Michael had made his decision. He would confront Brenda directly with evidence in hand, recording the conversation on his phone for protection. He dressed in his work clothes, a button-down shirt and slacks, wanting to project professionalism rather than the anger still simmering inside him. Brenda's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac larger than the surrounding homes, with immaculate landscaping that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. At precisely 7:30 a.m., early enough to catch her before she might leave for the day, Michael rang the doorbell, laptop tucked under his arm and phone recording in his pocket. The door swung open to reveal Brenda in a crisp linen pantsuit, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Her smile faltered momentarily when she saw who stood on her doorstep. "Michael," she said, recovering quickly. "What brings you by so early?" As if on autopilot, she reached for a clipboard hanging near the door. "My mailbox was removed from my property this weekend," he said, keeping his voice level. "I'd like to discuss that with you." Brenda's expression didn't change. "Yes, I noticed it was gone when I drove by yesterday. Have you reported the vandalism to the police?" Her tone was concerned, but her eyes held a challenge. "It wasn't vandalism," Michael replied, opening his laptop. "I have security footage showing exactly what happened. Would you like to see it?" Something flickered across Brenda's face, surprise perhaps that he had evidence, but she quickly composed herself. "That won't be necessary." "So you admit taking it?" "As HOA treasurer and enforcement officer, I am authorized to remove non-compliant fixtures after the warning period expires." She lifted her clipboard and flipped through several pages. "According to my records, you were given notice on the 15th, with 10 days to correct the violation. That period expired on Friday." Michael fought to keep his voice steady. "You physically removed my property without further notice. You dug up my lawn and took my personal mail." "The mailbox was in violation," Brenda said, waving her hand dismissively. Section 14.2 of the covenant clearly states that the HOA reserves the right to remedy violations if homeowners fail to do so within the specified timeframe. I emailed the board multiple times asking for clarification. I documented at least 5 identical mailboxes on our street that have received violations. Perhaps those will be addressed in due time, Brenda said, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. Enforcement is an ongoing process. This isn't about enforcement, Michael said. This is about you specifically targeting me. And regardless of HOA rules, tampering with a mailbox is a federal offense. At this, Brenda actually laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Oh, please, this is HOA property, dear. Federal laws don't override our covenant. The mailbox was in violation and I acted within my authority. I like my mailbox returned immediately, Michael said, along with any mail that was inside it. Brenda crossed her arms. That won't be possible. The non-compliant fixture has been disposed of as per HOA procedure. He disposed of my property without my permission. I disposed of a covenant violation, she corrected. If you need a new mailbox, Wilson's Hardware carries all approved models. My husband can help you select one that complies with regulations. Her smile returned, satisfied. He's offering a special this week, only $199 for the standard model, installation included. Michael stared at her, the pieces falling into place. This wasn't just about power or rules. It was about profit. So that's what this is about. Forcing homeowners to buy overpriced mailboxes from your husband's store? Brenda's smile hardened. That's quite an accusation, Mr. Chen. One that could be considered defamatory if repeated to others. She began to close the door. I suggest you focus on bringing your property into compliance rather than making wild allegations. Good day. After researching online, Michael learned that mailboxes were indeed protected by federal law and tampering with them was a serious offense. He filed a report with the local postmaster, providing the security footage as evidence. The postal inspector assigned to the case took it surprisingly seriously, explaining that mail theft and tampering with postal property were federal crimes that could result in hefty fines and even imprisonment. Within days, Brenda received an official visit from postal authorities, who explained the severity of her actions regardless of HOA rules. Back at home, Michael paced his living room, Brenda's smug expression still burning in his mind. He pulled out his phone and searched mailbox tampering laws, clicking through several results before finding the official USPS website section on mail theft and tampering. What he read stopped him cold. According to U.S. Code Title 18, Section 1705, whoever willfully or maliciously injures, tears down, or destroys any letter box or other receptacle intended or used for the receipt or delivery of mail on any mail route shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 3 years or both. 3 years, Michael whispered, staring at his screen. This wasn't just a minor infraction, it was a federal felony. He continued reading, learning that mailboxes were considered federal property and that interfering with mail delivery was taken extremely seriously by postal authorities. Armed with this knowledge, Michael called the local post office the next morning and explained his situation to the clerk, who answered. "You'll want to speak with the postmaster," she said immediately. "This is definitely something we take seriously." 20 minutes later, Michael was seated across from Postmaster Jenkins, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She listened without interruption as Michael recounted the entire saga, from the violation notice to Brenda's brazen theft, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Do you have this security footage with you?" she asked when he finished. Michael nodded, opening his laptop and turning it toward her. She watched the video twice, her expression darkening. "Mr. Chen, what you're describing is indeed a federal offense," she said, removing her glasses. "Tampering with mailboxes falls under our jurisdiction, not your HOA's. Even if your mailbox didn't meet some neighborhood aesthetic standard, Ms. Wilson had absolutely no right to remove it without Postal Service authorization." "What happens now?" Michael asked. "I'm going to refer this to our postal inspector," she replied, already typing an email. "They handle investigations into mail theft and tampering. Given that you have clear video evidence, I expect they'll take action fairly quickly." The postal inspector, a man named Garrett Thomas, called Michael that same afternoon. He had already reviewed the footage forwarded by the postmaster and wanted to meet in person to take an official statement. "This is pretty cut and dry," Inspector Thomas said when he arrived at Michael's house the following day. He was younger than Michael expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, but carried himself with the authoritative bearing of a seasoned law enforcement officer. "She removed a mailbox without authorization and interfered with mail delivery. We take these matters very seriously." Michael provided his statement along with copies of the HOA violation notice and his unanswered emails to the board. Inspector Thomas took photographs of the hole where the mailbox had been and the scattered mail that Michael had collected. "What about my mail going forward?" Michael asked. "I still don't have a mailbox." We'll arrange temporary delivery to the post office for pickup until you can install a new one, Thomas assured him. And just so you know, the Postal Service has specific regulations about mailboxes, but they have nothing to do with the color being Oak Ridge Standard Black. He smiled wryly. As long as it's secure, accessible to carriers, and properly labeled, the USPS doesn't care what shade of black it is. 2 days later, Michael was working from home when he noticed a Postal Service vehicle pull up in front of Brenda's house. Inspector Thomas, now in full uniform, and another official approached her door. Through his window, Michael could see Brenda's expression shift from her usual confident smile to confusion, then alarm as she listened to whatever the inspector was saying. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes, with Brenda's body language becoming increasingly defensive. At one point, she tried to close the door, but Inspector Thomas placed his hand on it, seemingly insisting the conversation continue. Finally, Brenda accepted what appeared to be official paperwork, her face pale and tight as the postal. The Postal Service fined Brenda $5,000 for tampering with a mailbox and obstructing mail delivery, a federal offense that no HOA bylaw could override. Additionally, the investigation revealed she had removed other residents' property without proper authority, using the HOA as her personal enforcement tool. At the next HOA meeting, attended by nearly every homeowner in the community, Brenda was voted off the board. Michael installed a new mailbox identical to his original one, now with a small, discreet sticker at the base noting it was protected by federal law. The new HOA board, eager to repair community relations, revised their bylaws to include explicit recognition of federal protections for mailboxes. As for Brenda, neighbors noticed she became remarkably quiet about other people's property, though she could occasionally be seen measuring her own grass with a ruler, muttering about standards. Word spread through Oak Ridge estates like wildfire. Within days of Brenda's encounter with the postal inspectors, Michael received texts and emails from neighbors he'd never even met. "Is it true?" Dave asked, leaning over the fence that separated their yards. "Did Brenda really get hit with a federal fine for stealing your mailbox?" Michael nodded. "Inspector Thomas called yesterday. She's being fined the maximum amount, $5,000. Plus, she has to pay restitution for the mailbox and installation." Dave whistled. "Couldn't happen to a nicer person," he said with a grin. "You know she's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, right? Last summer, she confiscated the Rodriguez family's basketball hoop while they were on vacation because it was improperly secured. And the year before that, she removed the paddles, garden gnomes in the middle of the night. Called them unauthorized lawn ornaments." As more stories emerged, Michael realized his case had broken a dam of silence. Neighbors who had suffered quietly under Brenda's reign of terror were finally speaking up. The Rodriguez family filed a police report about their missing basketball hoop. The Pathels demanded the return of their garden gnomes or payment for their replacement. 3 other homeowners came forward with security footage showing Brenda measuring their garage doors, fences, and in one bizarre instance, the angle of their holiday lights, all while making detailed notes on her ever-present clipboard. 2 weeks after the citation, the HOA president and mild-mannered retiree named Arnold Fletcher called an emergency board meeting. The community center was packed, with homeowners lining the walls after all the seats were filled. Michael hadn't seen this many of his neighbors in one place since moving in. Brenda arrived precisely on time, head held high despite the whispers that followed her entrance. She took her usual seat at the board table, arranging her papers and clipboard with practiced precision, as if this were any other meeting. Arnold called the meeting to order with a nervous tap on his gavel. "As you all know, we're here to address recent concerns about enforcement of HOA guidelines." "Concerns?" called out Mrs. Rodriguez from the back. "My children's basketball hoop was stolen. My gnome collection was irreplaceable," Mr. Patel added. Arnold raised his hands for quiet. "Please, everyone will have a chance to speak. First, I want to address the incident involving Mr. Chen's mailbox." All eyes turned to Michael, who stood when Arnold gestured to him. He briefly recounted the events, ending with the postal inspector's findings. "The Postal Service has made it clear," Michael concluded, "that mailboxes are under federal jurisdiction. No HOA rule can override that protection." Arnold nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, well, that brings us to the first item on our agenda. The board proposes amending our bylaws to explicitly recognize federal protections for mailboxes and to clarify that HOA enforcement cannot involve removal of property without proper legal authorization." "What about everything else she's taken?" someone shouted. Arnold cleared his throat. "We're also conducting a review of all enforcement actions taken in the past 3 years. If any property was improperly removed, the HOA will make restitution." "That's not enough." Mrs. Rodriguez stood. "She's abused her position. She shouldn't be on the board at all." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Arnold looked pained. "According to our bylaws, removal of a board member requires a 2/3 vote of the membership." "Then let's vote," someone called out. What followed was the most dramatic HOA meeting in Oak Ridge Estates history. One by one, homeowners stood to share their stories of Brenda's overzealous enforcement. The Wilsons' hardware connection emerged as a pattern. Many violations had been remedied with purchases from her husband's store, often at inflated prices.